Welcome to today's webinar, Root of the Problem, How to Uncover the Source of Common Landscaping Problems, brought to you by Landscape Management Magazine and our sponsor of the event, Quali-Pro. Today you will be learning how to approach common landscape problems so you can properly identify, understand, and resolve them. Our expert from Quali-Pro will show us what factors to look at while providing us with a helpful troubleshooting checklist. I'm Grace Ryback from North Coast Media, Content Marketing Project Manager for Landscape Management, and I will be the moderator for today's event. Before we get started, I want to let you know that today's webinar will be recorded. You are currently in a listen-only mode. A recording of this webinar will be posted to landscapemanagement.net/webinars and will also be emailed to you tomorrow. Now at this time, I'd like to acquaint you with the ways in which you can participate during today's presentation. Please notice the Q&A panel on the left side of your console. If you have a question, type it in the panel's text box, then click Submit to place your question in queue. We encourage you to ask and enter any questions you may have for our speakers throughout the presentation. We will address these questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A portion. If you experience any technical difficulties during today's event, you may use the same Q&A panel to the left of the screen to submit your issue, and Assistant Producer Mackenzie Schoner or I will personally assist you. You may learn more about our presenter by viewing his photo, bio, and email address in the panel located in the upper left-hand corner of your console. And if you're logged into your social media accounts, you can share the webinar's title, description, and URL with your friends or colleagues using the Share This Webinar widget. Now, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. We are very grateful and excited to have Ian Rodriguez joining us today. Ian is the Technical Service Manager supporting Quali-Pro product development at Control Solutions, Inc. He has more than 25 years of experience in the turf and ornamental industries, including academia, design and installation, pest control, and maintenance. Prior to joining Quali-Pro in 2019, Ian was the Director of Technical Services for the Florida region with Brightview Landscape Services. He'll be lending this expertise from his decades of industry experience and time in research to us today. Now, at this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Ian, who will kick the presentation off. Ian, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Grace, and thank you for everyone who's in attendance today. As Grace explained, I'm here to talk about troubleshooting in a landscape. And rather than try and focus on a lot of specific issues like say, okay, here's this particular pest on this particular plant, here's the product that you want to use to control it or to help mitigate that problem, I'll talk about more of an overall process. I will have some specific examples worked into the conversation. But I want to describe a thought process, so to speak, that I used to use when I would be called in often to troubleshoot landscape problems that were beyond sort of the normal run-of-the-mill problems. Most of us in the industry, you know, as we gain experience, you get to know relatively quick what are the most common problems in your particular region and your particular type of properties. And so, you know, some of them are slam dunk easy calls. What I want to talk about today is, you know, if the slam dunk easy solutions aren't taking care of the problem. It's not necessarily that maybe the chemical approach didn't work. There may be, and often are, other underlying driving factors to these problems that also need to be addressed, because anything that tilts the, well, literally landscape towards the direction of a pest issue more into their favor is going to make the severity even worse, and the chronic level of that problem even more severe. So landscape issues can be naturally occurring, such as insect pests that maybe occur seasonally in certain regions, but a lot of them can be man-made. It can be things as simple as a chemical burn from, I'll give a couple examples of that. It may also be, and often is, unfortunately, things that are inherent to the original design on the landscape, right? So in the management side of and maintenance side of the industry, we basically inherit problems that come with the site when we pick up new work. Now, if we happen to be the ones who designed and installed it, well, then it's on us. But oftentimes we have to deal with what's already existing on the site, the good and the bad. And so some of those often lead to chronic issues, and we'll talk about some examples of that. What it boils down to is you want to make sure that you're identifying maybe not so much the singular problem, but any additional problems that are also related that may be causing this problem or driving the severity of that problem. If you can identify and sometimes mitigate those additional factors, you'll be a lot more successful, and in turn, you'll have, a lot more efficient operation and a lot more happy customers. Because, it's sometimes easy to get into the mode of, well, a problem pops up, we just want to say we're doing this. So we're doing this, we're going to do this, we're going to take this action, this action, this action. Well, over time, if you're always giving actions and plans and you're never really solving the issue, now some, are just seasonal issues, and we'll get into a little bit of that. But sometimes that story gets old after a while, and people start thinking about maybe there's better options out there. So anything that you can control or propose that you maybe make a change to address, it's good to try and zero in on those things. Okay, so in my last job, I'd often get text messages and emails, sometimes many a day, along these lines. I'd get a photo and a text message that says, "Hey, Doc, what do you think about this?" And almost always my immediate reaction is, I think I need more information here. I can see, and anyone who's familiar with Florida landscapes probably can tell that's St. Augustine grass, and also that it's got a problem, right? So, knee-jerk reaction might be, well, the number one pest problem in St. Augustine is chinch bugs. You might see dieback of grass like this. You'll see some yellowing, discoloration of the turf associated with their damage. And so you might automatically, and the average Joe may say, well, that's chinch bugs. You need to do an insecticide application. Not so fast. So also, I would consider who sent the message. And, if, in this case, I might think to myself, well, Alejandro certainly knows what chinch bugs damage is, certainly knows how to check for chinch bugs. He would not send me a picture of this if it were chinch bugs. He's probably already checked that. So keep those kind of things in mind, according to how experienced your personnel might be in your company and your situation. So as far as the process, what I always kind of try and think of is try and go in this order. And first consider what is normal. So we'll talk about that. Checking the obvious and sometimes maybe the not so obvious. Taking closer looks when you need to. Sometimes this might involve, getting down on the ground and digging around in the grass. Some it might involve the use of a hand lens, etc. And then, if you can't properly ID the situation or a particular pest or disease or something like that, how do you get help to help figure that out? So we'll talk about that some. And then all of it leads into how do you propose a solution to this problem? So we'll start off with what's normal. So it's important, in order to be able to judge the health of a plant, you've got to understand what it's supposed to look like in optimal conditions, right? So, this is just it's going to take time for anyone, whether you're new to the industry or whether you're new to a particular region or a particular type of landscape, for example. it takes some time to get familiar with what those plants are and how they should perform in various settings. You can have a lot of disparity even within the same species from one variety to the next in terms of what they look like, the size that they grow to, maybe even what the shape of the leaves are, depending on what stage of their growth life cycle they're in, et cetera. It can get really convoluted, especially with ornamental plants. There's like 5 or 6 different varieties in this photo, but they're all of the same species. They're hostas. Not that was a common plant in Florida, but it's a good example in this photograph that I have. Most landscape designs and design like books, classes, extension guides, things along those lines, most of them stress the phrase, pick the right plant for the right place. And that is, one of the big tenets of landscape design, if not the most important thing of landscape design, and by extension, landscape maintenance. So if you're starting off and you inherit, or you unfortunately maybe even designed in plants without considering this, somebody down the line is going to deal with the consequence. And so here's a very common example I used to run into a lot. These are Italian Cypress, and true to their common name, they're pretty well adapted to coastal conditions. However, coastal conditions in South Florida are quite different than coastal conditions in Italy, for example. So these are a little more adaptable to, more arid type coastal climates where you got good, air circulation, relatively low humidity, certainly things that you don't necessarily have in South Florida. Add insult to injury here. These were designed and installed in a dog park between 2 high-rise condominiums, where, as you can imagine, they had maybe a couple of hours of direct sunlight a day. And so all those things add up to adverse growing conditions for this particular species of tree, and a tendency towards fungal diseases, including, as these were affected with a Ceridium canker disease. You might see there's bleeding sap on that one in the forefront at the base of the trunk there from the canker. And, that's an incurable disease. So at this point, these trees are lost. And to be honest, they never really had a good chance anyway. And so that's maybe an extreme example, but you'll run into a lot of these, unfortunately. Not this specific one maybe, but other similar type examples. So it's always something to consider. Is this plant, in the perfect conditions on this particular part of the site even, is this plant able to thrive here? And if the answer is no, then, you've got something that you got to think about, a solution, or maybe a little more than just, there's a magic bullet fertilizer or a control product or something like that that's going to miraculously make these adapted to something that they're not naturally adapted to. That said, you can maybe make very sound plant selections, but other things inherent to the site might trip it up. These are, you can't see the tops here, but this is a lot of royal palms in a landscape. And that white around the base of these palms, that's not a decorative stone mulch kind of thing. That's the soil. So this is a almost pure lime rock, crushed lime rock soil here that probably came out of the 40-foot bottom of that retention pond behind you in the background there. And unfortunately, that's the way a lot of new construction gets made in South Florida. Because of the nature of the climate and the tropical storm season, first and foremost, they got to make sure it drains when we have tropical systems, et cetera, down there. So unfortunately, the spoils that they sometimes even dynamited out of that hole get spread out, and that's what the landscape gets plopped down into. So what does that mean for these plants? Well, these royal palms here, they're pretty much native to South Florida and Cuba. And so, they can tolerate some of this. But when you've got this kind of soil and you're looking at pH probably easily in the neighborhood of 8.3, you start running into some pretty inherent issues in terms of solubility of fertilizers that you might apply. And I'll touch on this a little bit more later in the talk, but palms are really fickle, some more than others, but they can be really fickle about, especially micronutrient deficiencies. So we'll maybe get back into that a little bit later. But that's something to consider. I mean, whether it's you know, in this case, a really poor soil condition, it may just be chemically the soil, you know, and mineral components of the soil may be okay, but due to construction, it may be extremely compacted. Well, that's another issue that you've got to address or try and overcome. If, you know, the final grading, they weren't taking that into account maybe. So, you know, once you check off the plant, is this plant really suited to the site, to the conditions, and maybe even the soils of that site? I start shifting to, you know, maybe what I would call the obvious. And the two big ones to me are water and sunlight. Not only the amount of sunlight, but the quality of the light and the duration of that light. So starting with water, you know, most people think of water issues in a landscape as not enough water. And depending on where you're at, and depending on the landscape in particular, that's often the case. Here's kind of an extreme example. This planter box here, the wilting ground cover type plant there is called baby sunrose, and that's a succulent type plant. It's usually got excellent drought tolerance. So it'd probably be pretty good selection in this case. However, this box, as you can see, also has, well, you can't tell how big it is truly, but that's about a 15-foot medjool date palm, 15 to 20 feet as I recall. This box is about, if I'm being generous, it's probably 6 foot by 6 foot by 6 foot. So not a lot of soil volume there for the root system of either of these plants to exploit in terms of water. Now, that said, they did install irrigation here. But, you know, this is a pool deck. Overspray, especially in Florida, can often turn into mildew and algae and things like that. So drip irrigation is often used in this situation. They had 2 rings of the Netafim, I think, that brownish colored drip line in here. And long story short, not nearly enough volume can come out of that kind of a system to support this palm. To add insult to this injury, this on a pool deck facing the Atlantic Ocean. So there's like constant, virtually constant 20+ mile an hour breezes coming in. And so that in full sun adds up to about probably the highest transpiration rates you're going to see in a landscape, which means high water volume use, particularly on a large palm like this. And, you know, people down there often I heard referred to, well, they're desert palms, quote, desert palms, to talking about date palms. Well, they don't grow in the desert. If they're growing in the desert, they're either irrigated or they're in like an oasis type situation. So they're not, it's not like they're cacti. You know, you're not going to find them growing in a swamp. But anyway, I digress. This is a situation where the irrigation system had to be redesigned on all these planters to solve the problem. And unfortunately, you know, leading up to this, you say, well, what's the water status here? And the answer was, in this case, as I recall, well, it's not water. We're running it twice a day. We're running it every day. And, you know, took about 2 seconds to realize it was indeed water. No matter how much they were running the system here, it just could not cope with the volume required. Right down the street from that last example is this one, and this is up on, I think, about a 6-story observation deck. And as you can see, they were having drought stress issues here. Behind those buildings in the background, again, is the Atlantic Ocean, and so the associated breezes coming in were at play here as well, with six stories off the ground. And, you know, plenty of sprays are certainly working there, but that wind, and in this case, you know, sheltered behind that wall, drip was probably a better choice in this particular case. Virtually, you know, 80% of this water was not hitting the ground, at least not in the intended part of the ground here, and that was leading to drought stress. So you can't just rely on whether the irrigation is functional or whether the irrigation is what the program is at that particular time of the year to determine moisture status. You gotta check it more closely than that. The flip side is too much water. Anytime on the left here, I'm not sure how well that's come across. If you've got green algae growing on the surface of your mulch, or moss maybe, that's a pretty good indication that there's maybe excessive moisture going on there. A foot away from where that shot was taken were declining plants, and you could pull them out of the ground, and the roots were obviously going to be black. Okay, roots need water, but they also need oxygen. So you've got to have aeration in the soil, or you're just going to have plant decline if it's always saturated. And so no amount of you've obviously got some sort of root rot going on if the roots are black, but the roots didn't die because of the root rot in this situation. They died because they were, drowned effectively. And no amount of fungicide, methanoxam drenches, or what have you is going to turn that around if that drainage isn't addressed. Likewise, here on the right, this is a planter with junipers seem to be doing okay in the front, but which are, pretty drought tolerant plants as they go. But the hedge in the background had died by the time I got there. And was completely brown. And my initial notion was, well, it just got too dry for them. But stepped foot in the bed and my foot sunk in up to my ankles. This is actually a planter area that's perched above a parking garage. And so it just didn't, drain to the actual ground. There was a drain system here that had long been plugged up, and it just, was basically like a bathtub there with plants' roots suffocating in it. So you can have that other extreme. You can have too little water, too much water. Sometimes, especially in turf settings, you may see things like sedges, or in this case, pennywort or dollarweed, that are so-called indicator weeds. They tend to thrive in high moisture environments. And if you've got this level of dollarweed going on, there's a little bit of St. Augustine hiding underneath that dollarweed you might be able to see still. There's chemical options for controlling this weed. We've got a product called Fahrenheit that I would reach for in this case. However, it's just a matter of time if the underlying soil condition isn't addressed before, the weeds are going to come back. And, this level of dollarweed in this example is a definite problem going on. Here it was a combination of poor drainage and just excessive irrigation. So they thought they were doing the right thing, but in reality, they were basically killing their grass. And additionally, in a situation like this, while you can pick an effective herbicide approach, what happens in 2 weeks when all of that weed is gone and there's about 10% turf cover left there? So another thing you got to keep in mind if things are allowed to progress to this point. So you can certainly control it. So, if you're asked, can you handle this problem, you might say, oh yeah, I can control that weed. But you might also want to add, but we need to have a plan for what we're going to do after that, because there's not much turf remaining there at this point. So we need to talk about either sod renovation, etc., or potentially, addressing drainage if that's something that's an option. So just to kind of wrap up on the water, all the wet checks and checking for things like broken heads here on the left, making sure that's not a problem, making sure the clock's not turned off, it's functional, the program suits the site, suits the time of year. All that stuff's great, but at the end of the day, I used to tell our people that soil probes don't lie. So get yourself a soil probe, stick it in the ground. You don't just want to look at the upper couple of inches you can scratch with your foot or your boot or your hands. You want to see what's going on down there at the full depth of the root ball of whatever plant is you're looking at, the depth of that root system. You can spend, a couple $100 on one of these, or you can spend probably less than $40 on them. I always went the cheap route because I ended up leaving them in various people's vehicles and stuff multiple times a year or so. But, they don't have to be fancy. Just something you can put in there, pull out a core, You know, and the rule of thumb applies. If it crumbles in your hand, it's dusty, it's too dry. If it's soaking wet, you know, you get like a rotten, what do you call it, a stale, like wet rag kind of smell. It's anaerobic. And so you need to do something about drainage, or at least see if maybe you can dial back the irrigation in a case like that. The next obvious thing I think about is lights. I touched on this a little bit already with the Italian Cypress example. But in this case, this is more St. Augustine, and this is under a heavy, dense, mature live oak canopy, a very desirable feature in a landscape, but not real great for growing turf grass. And you know, people like to say, well, but it's St. Augustine. It's the most shade-tolerant warm season turf grass. And while that may be true in terms of plants in general, warm season turf has very, very poor shade tolerance. You know, compared to Bermuda grass, this has got really good shade tolerance, but not compared to these gingers, I believe those were in the background there, or dracaenas, whatever they are. Much more shade tolerant plant than St. Augustine. So this is the kind of situation where, you know, in this case we had chronic gray leaf spot issues here, and we could spray and did spray, you know, thiophanate methyl, various fungicides trying to mitigate that. But in the long run, you know, there's just not enough light here to prevent from the day you installed it, basically a long, slow decline for turf in this situation. So what are your alternatives? Well, look to a ground cover as a replacement, something that does have shade tolerance. I would not recommend in a landscape setting in particular cutting out or thinning out trees for the sake of, you know, what is this, a pallet, maybe a pallet and a half worth of St. Augustine sod. In some rare occasions, if someone insists because of a design or maybe, you know, things like event lawns and things like that at hotels and resorts, you know, if it's an option that's agreeable to the customer and agreeable to you and your contract situation and being paid for the work, you know, maybe periodic programmed replacement of the sod is the way to go in a situation like this. But in most situations, it's something that's not going to really be a long-term solution. So that's too little light. You can also run into too much light. This is a leaf of Ecclusia, which is a species that's a native of sorts in Florida and very tolerant of full sun. This happened to be a job where we came in and the prior contractor had abandoned it, or certainly abandoned doing any shearing for the last probably 6 months. And so they had some overgrown portions of their hedges, and we had to do some pretty dramatic shearing and cutbacks. And so when that sort of thing happens, you can even have sun scald on plants that are otherwise full sun tolerant, because once we're in the interior and very well shaded parts of the canopy are now exposed to the full afternoon sun, you can actually get some scalding. So this over time is going to progress to probably some fungal, some saprophytic fungi growth on this leaf, on that tissue that's already dead. But this is a case that of the sun actually did the damage, not the fungi that might develop on this several days later. So, you know, in terms of light, it always pays to look up, look at the surrounding buildings, any tall structures, trees, certainly, and think about it. If you're there in the morning, think about, okay, where's north, where's south? Okay, think about how the sun moves. Say, what's this going to look like this afternoon? What's the sunlight situation going to be here? Were there any trees removed recently? And suddenly this is full sun where maybe it used to be shade. Those are the kind of things to be thinking about when you're going and walking through a landscape and trying to troubleshoot. I've just got a couple more sort of man-made things that you might inherit in a landscape here that I kind of file under kind of obvious. They're obvious, at least in principle, the things that we would, you know, if we thought about it, we might avoid, but sometimes you come in on a job, you pick up a new account, you know, there's no telling what the current status might be unless you actually look. So this was a case, we had a boulevard and dozens of red maples that had been installed about within a year prior to us taking over. And they were all declining. They were yellowing, they were dropping leaves, and it wasn't winter or fall. You know, a lot of rain, a lot of moisture potential in South Florida, but, you know, maple trees, you often see them native in Florida growing on the edges of swamps. You know, they're pretty tolerant of that sort of thing, at least if it's not constant. But what was going on here, if you can't tell already, was there was over a foot of mulch piled on top of each one of these with a bubbler underneath that was watering them on a daily basis. And so, you know, if these trees were planted and well established before that mulch was installed like that, they'd probably have plenty of roots out into the surrounding turf to where it wouldn't even phase them. But when you come in and this tree, 90% at this point, if not 100% of its roots are still in the original root ball because it was recently planted, and you cover the entirety of that root system in a foot of mulch, and then you're watering it on top of that, you can imagine that the oxygen in that soil where the root ball is going to be very, 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 very low. And so you start seeing root dieback, symptoms of, you know, what might be mistaken as drought stress when it's actually kind of the opposite going on. In this case, not necessarily saturated with water, but just depleted of all oxygen because of that thick layer of mulch preventing any exchange to the atmosphere. You can run into who knows what on landscapes. This was a job I was walking. It was a preliminary walk. We were going to bid this job, and so I was asked. It was a pretty big job. We were walking it. Came across this. I'd seen some. This is a plant called cocoa plum. It's native. It grows like. I mean, at my house, I used to spray it every couple of weeks with growth regulator to try and slow it down so I wouldn't have to shear it so much. When I would see this in a landscape and it was doing poorly, usually something funky was going on. So I walked over to it, and lo and behold, and we found this to be the case throughout the landscape. There would be little pockets of a half dozen to maybe 10 cocoa plums that somebody had put in the ground and left the pot on them, believe it or not. So, you know, I don't know. I used to see things like this on really large projects more often than not. And I think sometimes it may go back to, you know, maybe hiring some temp labor on big projects that maybe weren't supervised as well as they should have been. And so maybe you got one guy just, you know, out of laziness or just ignorance, maybe, lack of supervision, putting plants in the ground without taking the pots off, I guess. The only thing I can figure in this situation. So unfortunately, not as rare as you might think if you walk a lot of landscapes over time. A very common reason for plant failure I used to run into is deep installation. You know, you can plants, especially, you know, so-called bulletproof or go-to plants in a region can generally take a lot of abuse, and they're usually pretty tough. And so this is an Indian hawthorn, which is it's been common for just 30, 40 years or more in Florida. Kind of fallen a little bit out of favor these days, but because of some leaf spot issues. But anyway, this was planted, obviously. Line B represents the original level that it was in the pot. And line A is the eventual depth, whether it was installed that way or whether that was years of mulch built up, I can't recall. But at any rate, by the time we pulled it out of the ground, it was a good 6 to 8 inches too deep in the ground. And so that eventually caused the complete collapse of this plant and the failure of this plant and several dozen plants alongside of it. You know, it may not be a crash and burn right off the get-go. Some plants will crash and burn. You plant them a couple inches too low, you'll know it within a couple of weeks. This was an example that, you know, to all outward appearance, it seemed to be doing okay. But 2-3 years down the line, you start, you know, density of the canopy starts falling. Maybe you start seeing a little more leaf spot disease than you normally would. Good indicators that the plant's struggling. And when the plant's struggling, it's always going to be more susceptible to pests and any other kind of stress, abiotic stresses as well. A big reason I used to see, a common reason I'd see tree failures was compromised root systems. Sometimes they were just too constricted in the area they were planted in. More often than not, they had inherent root faults that were, stemmed from some stage in their production. They were in a pot for too long. Now, this illustrates this. This is along a street, and in this community, there's literally it's some neighborhood of 750 of these live oaks lining streets. And, about 1 out of every 20 had started declining. And, people get on the internet, they get online, and they start seeing, oak wilt disease that's, hitting out in California really hard at the time. And they're thinking, well, we've got oak wilt in all of our live oaks. Well, live oaks, and these are live oaks, they're about one of the toughest trees you can plant in a Florida landscape, and in a lot of the Southeast for that matter. Very, very tough, very resilient, very adaptable to poor soil conditions, etc. But when you see this 1 out of every 20, the canopy is we didn't really have dieback, but it's like, they're semi-deciduous. So they would shed leaves, and maybe a few fewer leaves would grow back every year. And over time, your canopy gets less dense. You start seeing more. I'm not sure if it's showing up on your screens, but ball moss and Spanish moss developing. Contrary to what some people think, that the moss isn't causing the decline. The moss is there because the tree is already declining, and there's enough light inside of that canopy for the moss to thrive. So nothing to do with the moss. The moss kind of gives you an indication that, this tree, yeah, it doesn't look good, but you know what? It probably hasn't looked good for the last several years. And the reason why is severe kinking and girdling of roots. You can see this is the trunk. This is a root that's crossing the trunk. It's actually cutting into the trunk on itself. And, this kink in the root, and you can see it turns again here, and these are going in a circular pattern on the outer, on the left there. This happened back in the nursery somewhere. These are all field-grown trees. But even field-grown nurseries, at some point, usually the liners were grown in a container or maybe up a 1 gallon size container when the tree farm gets them and puts them in the ground. And if you're not paying attention, that stuff can be below the surface. And I've worked a little bit here and there at some tree farms and seen them reject liners for that very reason, because they know that, yeah, they're going to produce that tree, but they sell these trees after 2-3 years on the landscape. They're probably going to start seeing issues with that tree. So for their long-term benefit, they would reject those liners because they didn't want to put out a subpar product. Sometimes some slip past, and I don't know exactly where these trees came from. I'm not disparaging anybody, but when trees are failing, always start looking at the roots. Is there a good root flare? Is it maybe too deep? Do you see indications of girdling roots or circling roots? Because that can be a major reason for trees to start failing. All right, some other sort of obvious to some issues, although I had to come look at this in person because in this case, unfortunately, the customer did not believe our on-site manager. Most of you probably see exactly what the problem was here. We've got someone was pressure washing these steps, poorly I might add, if you look at the pattern there. And they had obviously poured a jug of bleach down into the tank of the pressure washer and without consideration as to where that was going to flow to. And so we got chlorine burn all over that turf there. So that one was pretty easy to decipher. But, when you see patterns, especially plants that are up against a building, up against a wall in Florida, it was a pretty fair chance that it had been pressure washed or maybe painted recently, and some sort of solvent or cleaning agent had gotten on the foliage and caused some burn. Here's a good example of chemical burn in turf. You can see, most of you, this will be obvious that that's chemical burn. not because of the color, but because of the pattern. So, you know, diseases tend to grow in irregular patterns, maybe circular patches, you know, in case of like large patch, this is zoysia grass. But in this case, these angular, straight 90-degree corners on the damage here is a dead giveaway. That was a boom spray pattern. And in this case, they made mistakes in their mixture that particular day and burned this turf. It did recover, but zoysia is slow. It took a while to recover. So hopefully lesson learned. I think we salvaged that job. Did not lose the job because of that. It was, you know, it was an honest mistake. But certainly one to be avoided if at all possible. So, you know, inherent site conditions that may be a problem or hurdles to you, identify those. You know, certainly look for signs that it may be man-made burns or those sorts of things, or things that are working against the plant's overall vigor. But even when you have plants that have ideal conditions, you can still get pest issues, particularly insect pests. Sometimes has, you know, the pressure might have nothing to do with what the conditions in the soil or the conditions of that plant are. It's just a matter of it's that season. The plants in question are a good host for that particular pest, and you have the pest issue. So insect pests can be, you know, from the very obvious, like these grasshoppers that might be up to 5 inches long. You know, at that stage, any of you who are familiar with that lover grasshopper, you know, control at that stage is stomping on them with your boot. There's not much chemical options available when they get to that size. On the right here is an example of maybe the other extreme. And this is a Ficus Whitefly nymph up close. And while you can see them with the naked eye, it's difficult to tell if they're alive or if they're have already hatched from the nymph stage or metamorphosized, I guess is maybe the right term. And you might need to pull out your hand lens. Along with the soil probe, having a hand lens with you if you're doing these kind of inspections, those are the two best tools, along with a good camera, to help solve a lot of these issues. I got out of the truck on a job to walk a job site. I had one of these that I've had for probably 30 years now on a lanyard. I put it around my neck. I've kept it on my rear view mirror. I didn't walk on a job without one of these lenses. I, to this day, keep it in my backpack at all times. But where it came in handy here was, you know, this is an indication, this Ficus Whitefly. The typical treatment for this pest is to use a systemic insecticide, like a imidacloprid, soil drench preferably was the most effective approach. And, you know, you can get up to, with imidacloprid anyway, usually a neighborhood of 3 to 4 months of control on this pest. That said, the adult whiteflies flying around have no way of knowing whether that hedge has been drenched with imidacloprid or not. And so they're going to home in on that host plant. And clients see that, they know about this whitefly problem, and they freak out. They're like, you know, you just upsold me on $5,000 worth of imidacloprid drenches for these 2 miles of hedge or whatever. You know, we're talking lots of material here. This was a big pest in South Florida. And I'm still seeing whiteflies. Well, unless you educate them, and even your own personnel, I found, you can misinterpret the success of a chemical application. If the adults flying around is immaterial to whether or not the plant is protected. The damaging life stage were these nymphs. And so if you still saw 2 weeks after your soil drench, you were still seeing live nymphs, well then maybe you had a problem. Maybe you missed that. You had a gap in coverage. Maybe you had it run off instead of penetrate into the soil, etc. So, you know, in terms of not only identifying the problem, but following up and seeing if your approach is being successful is where this kind of a tool can also come in handy. So you'll get to know what your main pest foes are in an area. It's also good to try and educate your personnel on that as much as possible, and for any of this, for that matter. But even customers, because customers can ring your phone off the hook every time they see, what they perceive to be a pest when it may actually be a beneficial insect. And some of the beneficials are, not much to look at at certain stages of their life cycle. I always think of ladybug larvae. They're pretty ugly compared to the adult stage, but definitely beneficials. Very commonly seen, and people go, what the heck is that? So look for signs of, live insects, assuming you can identify the pest species properly. Also various signs of feeding, and even some indirect signs of insect activity. So we'll kind of run through a few photos here. Chewing damage, usually pretty obvious. You may not, in this case, this is looper damage on a bougainvillea. Something's obviously chewing it, but you're not going to probably spot the caterpillars during daylight hours. However, if you follow the poop trail here, up into just above where this leaf is, where there's some frass here, I guess the proper term for it is, you go up and you'll find a few leaves that are folded over, and the caterpillar during the day is hiding safe and sound inside of the leaf. So one example, chewing damage. Borers, very common, or maybe not very common, but a major deal if you do have them. In Florida, in palm trees, there's a long list of borers that are very important economic pests in landscaping and in forestry around North America and around the world. Emerald ash borer, pine, the southern pine beetles, et cetera, can be major pests. Sometimes you got to look a little closer, and the insects may not be as conspicuous, or the damage may be even not so conspicuous. Stippling is what we refer to, these, thousands of little brown spots on a leaf. Fairly common sign of spider mite activity. A lot of people, because of the name, and they do make webbing, or can make webbing, think that that's the telltale sign. They see a spider web of some sort, and they think they've got spider mites. The real good telltale sign, besides the mites themselves, is the stippling damage that they commonly produce. On the right here, this is it looks like it might be a disease, a leaf spot of some sort, but that's scarring from thrips. In particular, an exotic species of thrips called a chili thrip. They were pretty difficult to control, and sometimes had to develop rotational programs of multiple products, multiple active ingredients to really nip them in the bud, so to speak. You got to get familiar with those kind of signs for your particular region and the pest challenges that you'll face in your neck of the woods. Sooty mold, when it's this heavy, it's a slam dunk. You've got piercing, sucking insect issues. In this case, it was whitefly in a palm tree overhead. That's some really heavy sooty mold there. So, the pest isn't even on this actual plant. It's on the plant in the canopy above this plant. So, that's, most of us know that. But that's something that can be lost on a lot of people, especially if they're new to the pest, or maybe new to the industry, or the customer, for that matter, may not understand that. In terms of diseases, I would say are a little more commonly going to be seen with or associated, let's say, with more adverse conditions in the soil, or maybe in terms of moisture and rainfall, more so probably than insects, or definitely, I would say, more so than insects. And so you got to get familiar with the various signs of diseases, and in some cases you got to discern from one disease agent to the next. Leaf spots come in a lot of different flavors. You can get, your fungal leaf spots tend to often have this smoke ring on the left here. If you take the handlins out, you can sometimes see little dark brown or black little raised knobs or pinheads, let's say, of the fruiting bodies inside of these lesions. Whereas bacterial leaf diseases on the right, as an example, you'll often see, at least in the early stages, a lot of them will stay confined within the leaf veins. as opposed to, these fungal spots on the left are growing right across all of those veins and those oleander leaves. This on the right was a bacterial disease in a ficus leaf. We ran it, became a chronic issue with this particular plant that was otherwise very bulletproof. If you got over the first growing season in this disease, you were home free with that plant. Downy mildew goes more than just on impatiens anymore. There was a new issue started turning up. It was a very problematic one on viburnum hedges that had come to replace those ficus hedges I was talking about earlier in terms of a really go-to privacy hedge, and they started getting this downy mildew and caused complete defoliation on miles of hedges in some cases. Why am I splitting hairs here on the types of leaf spot diseases? Well, not all control products are suited to all types of leaf spots or even all types of diseases. The bacterial disease in the prior slide, you need a product that has bactericide activity. So probably something with some copper in it. A lot of fungicides, azoxystrobin, thiophanate methyl can be used to address fungal leaf spots. Then you get into downy mildews like this, which are a true water mold of sorts, and you've got, that's going to narrow that range of fungicides in terms of what's going to be still effective against that particular disease. And then finally here on the right, this is an algal leaf spot on a magnolia here, and they're kind of raised spots more so than sunken spots. And I'm getting a note that I'm getting real short on time, so let me try and blaze through a few of these slides. Galls can be a sign of disease. Discolored wood, there's not a lot you can do about the vascular diseases in terms of chemical controls. Sometimes there are death sentence for trees. Cankers, growths of mushrooms or conchs can be pretty good indications that you've got serious vascular rot going on in woody plants, as well as some palms. Fertility can sometimes be a problem. For the most part, if you follow what the regional recommendations are from the extension services, they usually nail it pretty well and give you some pretty good guidelines. Use a complete program, balance the N, P, and K. Pay attention to micronutrients, at least, plan on 1 or 2 apps a year to include some micronutrients to kind of keep you in the clear there. Most of these can be diagnosed by looking at leaf symptoms. There's a lot of good online guides determining one from another. This is iron in bougainvillea. I've got boron on the left and magnesium in palm trees here. Phosphorus deficiency turning up more and more in Florida. A lot of phosphorus legislation, anti-phosphorus fertilizer stuff goes on down there at the local level. It gets really convoluted, and we're starting to see very legitimate phosphorus deficiencies here. The giveaway here was, the dog poop was providing enough phosphorus that they got a response here. As soon as we got a soil test confirming phosphorus where we could legally apply some in this municipality, it was like flipping the switch. It was the most beautiful green grass you could ask for. So if you get to the point where you've got a good idea and you know exactly what the problem is, and you need to pick a chemical control, and you want to know more about information about a particular product, the manufacturing sites are the place to go. Ours, as well as any of the others, are where you can go to get the latest label, which has all of the do's and do nots on it for use. Always read the label. It's the law. It goes without saying. You'll find SDS sheets. You'll find also recommendations, sometimes data on efficacy, sometimes articles or even programs describing how to use various products for specific issues. If you can't put your finger on exactly what the issue is, you can look to your local or regional extension sources. Always look for that .edu online resource for online resources. They're some of the best info, if not the best info out there. They're always evidence-based. They often offer very affordable diagnostic services like plant disease clinics that you can send in turf samples or plant leaf samples, et cetera, to, and they can tell you exactly what's going on. I would say always consider the region. I ran into a couple of examples where we had people trying to manage an issue that they had misdiagnosed because they were looking at Midwestern sort of fact sheets from Ohio State on a problem that was occurring in South Florida. And so the seasons weren't matching up, and it was causing them to misdiagnose a problem, and it became a long-term problem that we eventually solved. And it was just because of confusion, you know, thinking you had a very reliable source, which you did if you were in the right region. Also, get to know your local agent. Local agent is like gold. Your local extension agent, they can really help you out, but also support them. Attend their CU events, help them out when you can, field days, those sorts of things. It all helps them keep a better tab on what's going on in your landscapes and help you keep tabs on what's going on in general in the landscapes. They're exceedingly valuable when you start dealing with exotic pests. For example, here, you know, Penn State's got some really extensive information out there about the spotted lanternflies right now. That's a big problem in the, I guess, northern mid-Atlantic and northeast. You know, they give you advice on efficacy. They make recommendations that, you know, manufacturers even help get educated on so that we can do things like, you know, come up with 2EE recommendations and get approval from various states to make additions to labels, et cetera, to deal with those problems. So to try and wrap it up here, I know I'm running short on time. Back to my original case here, I think I need more information. So when I arrived on the site, you know, it was obvious that for St. Augustine anyway, we had certainly enough light, so light wasn't limiting. Soil moisture was also not limiting. I checked with a probe, and the clock seemed to be running fine. We weren't seeing symptoms of drought stress in the turf, so we eliminated it that way as well. So, you know, the next thing on the list is chinch bugs. Get down, you start looking for chinch bugs. It became obvious pretty quickly that the stolons and the runners were very discolored. They pulled up out of the ground very easily because the roots were rotting. And there's, you know, a couple of different options in terms of diseases that can cause root rot in turf, but in St. Augustine, the most likely culprit is a disease called take-all patch or take-all root rot. And indeed, that's what we had here going on. When we took a closer look at the stolons with a hand lens, we could see this black thread, I hope that's coming out here, which was a telltale sign of the disease of take-all root rot. So we, you know, being familiar with the extension publications out and all the work that Dr. Phil Harmon at UF has done on this disease, seeing his plots at field days, et cetera, and various talks, we know, or you would know, if you did all those things, that they recommend and find the best efficacy usually when they see these use of combinations, either tank mixes or combination products like Quali-Pro that combined an azoxystrobin, strobilurin fungicide with a DMI, like propiconazole in this case. And indeed, that's an excellent choice for controlling this particular fungal disease in this turf. But is that the end of the issue? In this case, no, because what we also could see when we got there on site, maybe it comes out in the picture, is we had unnatural patterns in the disease here. We had parallel lines of the worst damage here, and they were pretty obviously lined up in a mower rut pattern or a mower tire pattern here. And so why is that? Well, it's a root disease. So any plant that's facing pressure from a root disease, which, let's face it, this agent, you'll find this in any lawn in Florida. You'll find Gumanomyces that causes this disease. But when it causes you a problem is when it overcomes the plant's ability to deal with it or maybe even outgrow the damage. So when you have compacted soils due to infrequent mower direction, or if ever changes in mower direction, you know, you're going to develop less dense, weaker root systems over time. And so a lower level of disease pressure is going to amount to a bigger amount of damage in a case like that. So in addition to a fungicide program, you need to consider core aeration If you're already doing core aeration, think about going deeper or maybe increasing your frequency. The other big approach in a situation like this is to alternate your mower path. Easier said than done. This is a long boulevard, so it doesn't make sense to go perpendicular from to the street from a production standpoint, but you may be able to start at the sidewalk one week, start in the middle the next week, start down at the street, so you're at least overlapping and straddling some of those tire tracks from the week prior. You may even be able to switch up mower sizes periodically and give it a little bit of relief that way by changing the width on your swaths. So to kind of wrap it up, consider all those factors. What's normal? Is there something obvious here that we're missing? It's easy, especially when you're on a landscape on a regular basis, to kind of overlook something, and that's just life in general. Something you become familiar with, you're more likely to overlook something in that environment. Take a closer look when you need to. Get help whenever needed or when you're really stumped, because there's a lot of resources out there, particularly at university extension agencies, to get help in an affordable way. And then propose a solution based on your observations. In some cases, maybe it is just a chemical solution, but in other cases, it may be a bigger problem that you've got to address with maybe a renovation or a proposal for extra work. It all depends on the scope of your contract and the nature of the problem, whether, if you caused the problem, unfortunately, you're kind of on the hook for it. And so, even big problems, we found that, and I found in my experience, the more you can educate your customer, the more you can explain the issue and what the practical solutions are, the more open they are to, even things that involve extra work, extra changes, even to a contract. The better you can educate them as well as your own personnel, the better you'll be able to deal with these kind of problems. And finally, just, if it's a big project, a big solution, it doesn't necessarily, in all cases have to happen all at once. And so if you're kind of leery of coming to somebody with a, proposal for $60,000 worth of work, if you can cut it up into $5,000 or $10,000 chunks and say, look, let's try and phase this in over the next 3 years, maybe that's the approach to take with a customer. So at this point, I'd better stop talking and throw it back over to Grace. I appreciate the attention and hopefully can answer whatever questions you might have at this point. So let me turn it back over to you, Grace, and take it away. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ian. This has been great. I think you've provided a lot of really good and helpful practical information here. So at this point, we are going to jump into a few questions. We received some during the registration process. And if you have any questions now that you'd like to ask Ian, this is your chance to go ahead and submit those as well. So first question, how can these checklists and these solutions be scaled and used by crews with less knowledge to solve some basic problems on their own?
That's a good question. Something that we used to run into, and I personally used to run into a lot, is you may have a lot of expertise within a company, within a branch, but they're not necessarily on the job every day or even every week. And so, yeah, in a lot of cases, you got to depend on your crews, your foreman at least, if not your account managers, to kind of diagnose some of these and to become familiar with them. So anything you can do to promote their knowledge of, at least, look at the 80-20 rule, right? So, the big problems, certainly anyone in Florida, for example, here, who is on a landscape should definitely be able to recognize chinch bugs as an issue, right? They should be able to hopefully tell you, okay, this is different than what I saw last week. So you can start as simple as that, and then kind of bump it up the line through communication lines there in terms of who might ultimately be able to answer the question and come up with your plan of attack. So, internal training, certainly, if you're able to do so. Extension, offers a lot of these kind of, at least in Florida they did, a lot of training opportunities, very affordable. They're often happy, you know, usually maybe you got to provide the space and lunch for everybody, and they're happy to come and give you talk as long as you let them. You know, in Florida, we had, you know, anybody who handled any kind of pesticide, including just spraying Roundup, they had to have a certain level of training every year. And so that's one way we addressed it. That's part of that training. We made sure that we hit the high points, the 80% kind of the problems there. But, you know, you're always going to be challenged with new members of your team. You know, even people with, you know, decades of experience in one part of the country move to your neck of the woods, and you know, they're going to have a learning curve. So I don't have a 100% answer, but training and, you know, and education is always, you know, what you got to think about.
Okay, great. Yeah, those are some really good ideas. All right, here is a question that we received live just from one of our audience members. Can you revisit the examples of tree failures or tree decline, specifically the issues with roots?
Okay.
Can you touch on that briefly?
Yeah, I don't know if the slide, if I can go backwards on the slides or not at this point, but I'll try. Yeah, so trees. What I would run into a lot with trees, like I said, were the girdling roots or being planted too deep. Those were probably the two biggest issues. And so, you know, sometimes it's really obvious to see. Like, you know, this live oak example, these roots are exposed. It was easy to see that. You could see, I can't zoom in here. Hopefully you can see it well enough. In the center there, going from left to right, and then it curves down towards the lower right corner, that is not coming directly out of that trunk. That's coming from the side. It's wrapping around that trunk. And so what happens is, you know, that probably at least 10 years ago started as a little root kink when that root grew to the side of a container and it couldn't grow any further outward, and so it started curling. And it continues to curl typically, unless you can come in and you can cut that root and promote it to branch. And so some of that's just, you know, that's just part of production and quality control there to try and prevent those kind of things, not allowing things to get root bound before you pot them up in a production nursery. In this case, you know, when they get to this size, it starts becoming maybe a little bit iffy as terms of, now, you know, there's arborists and people who are very expert at this, this practice of coming in with what they call the, what do they call it? Not an air chisel. It's basically they come and they blast the soil away with air so they can really see all angles of this root system. And maybe you come in and where this one is crossing the other, you make a cut and it's enough that it splits that root, allows the larger root to continue to grow in girth, because that's what's happening. As these roots put on more and more diameter, they start squeezing each other out and strangling each other out. Now, some trees are more tolerant of that than others. I saw it a lot in live oaks, saw it a lot in field, and they were almost all field grown. A lot in pine trees, for whatever reason. I assume it's all happening in the liner stages, you know, because it was just as often seen in trees that I know for a fact were field grown as trees that were grown in containers. I don't know. I have no way of knowing if that answers the whole question, but that's you know, a not uncommon. If you see that gradual decline, in some cases it's like you may be having gradual decline for 3-4 years, and then suddenly you have an unseasonably dry year, and the remaining vascular tissue just can't keep up, and you see actual dramatic dieback of entire branches and things like that. And so, you know, it's not necessarily all gradual, but very, unfortunately, pretty common. You know, top-notch trees take more than just planting them and then coming back in 5 years and digging them up and balling and burlapping them. Good quality tree growers, they got to know what they're doing.
All right. All right, thank you. So we're going to do one final question before wrapping up today's event. So many times you hear prevention is the best treatment. What are the top precautions that you would encourage that we use to reduce or prevent disease spread in lawns and landscapes?
In terms of the big driving factor with most diseases is going to be moisture of in one way, shape, or form. Excessive moisture in the soil tends to lean towards root rot type diseases. Excessive or prolonged moisture on leaves, whether we're talking about turf leaves or landscape plant leaves or tree leaves even, tends to lean more towards things like patch diseases in turf, leaf spots on turf and ornamentals. And so for that reason, it's often preached when you talk about irrigation programs to try and water whenever possible early in the morning rather than in the evenings. Although, when you get into big commercial projects that maybe have 100 or 200 zones to run through on a system in a night, you got to kind of start going whenever you can. And so sometimes that expresses itself and is a reason why you might have a certain disease more severe in one part of a property than you do on another. Sun exposure plays into that as well with your irrigation programming. If you're irrigating a full sun, a western exposure the same as you are an eastern exposure that has a lot of trees, you're likely overwatering or underwatering one side of or another. And so one size doesn't fit all with your programs. There's no good golden rule that, you run rotor zones for 30 minutes and you run spray zones for 20 minutes or 15 or whatever. You kind of let the plants tell you what's going on. As far as preventive fungicide treatments, in landscaping, if you have to go so far as, I would say, if you have to go so far as, for diseases, of doing rolling fungicide on turf, like season-long type programs, one here or there for preventive, not typically kind of excessive. But if you have that kind of disease pressure and you eliminated the soil or the water issues, whether it's excessive or et cetera, if you've eliminated that, you still need to do constant fungicide applications. It's time to probably consider whether that plant is the right plant for that spot, whether it's turf or a particular species of shrub or what have you. You don't want to get too much into that, all season long kind of rolling applications on fungicides in landscapes typically. Now that said, you've got seasonal things like chinch bugs where, it's just the nature of that climate in that region of the United States. There's not a better selection for your turf than St. Augustine in most of those areas. But you just know you're inherently going to have to deal with chinch bugs. And so you might make a preventive app there. The same with pre-emergence. You'll end up saving a lot of chemical apps, post-emergent apps later by having a good pre-emergent program in place. I know those aren't diseases, but kind of along the same lines. One quick thing, and I'll shut up, the leaf spots on plants. Oftentimes, if you can cut back on the amount of overspray, like from your rotors in the turf, that rotor overspray into hedges is where a lot of those downy mildew issues I was talking about come from, and things like algal leaf spots. Once established, if you've made good shrub selections and once they get a good root system going, you can typically dial back the water quite a bit, even in very hot environments. Now, when you have a seasonable drought, you maybe have to up the frequency. But as hot as it gets in Florida, and as common as some people think you have to water every day or every other day, once trees get established, once shrubs get established, you can get away with very little irrigation, in my experience, and in turn, limit a lot of your disease and weed problems as a result.
All right. Thank you, Ian. And I want to thank everyone in attendance today for joining us for Root of the Problem, How to Uncover the Source of Common Landscaping Problems. Brought to you by Landscape Management Magazine and our sponsor of the event, Quali-Pro. If you have any additional questions for myself or for Ian, you can reach out directly via the email addresses you see in the slide. Today's presentation slides are also available to you for download via the resources panel that's at the bottom left corner of your console. And a recording of this webinar will be emailed to you tomorrow. You can also access the on-demand version of this webinar anytime from landscapemanagement.net/webinars. Upcoming webinars from Landscape Management also will be posted to that page. Once again, thank you all for attending, and we hope you'll join us for another great webinar.